a waitress returned a lost wallet to its owner. Unaware the CEO behind it would rewrite her future, the rain came down in heavy sheets, drumming against the grimy windows of the Rusty Spoon Diner, a small weathered establishment tucked into a forgotten corner of Chicago's South Side. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fried bacon, stale coffee, and the faint tang of cleaning solution that never quite masked the grease embedded in the cracked linoleum floor. It was pushing 10:30 p.m., and the diner was nearly empty, save for a trucker nursing a cup of decaf at the counter and a couple of teenagers splitting a plate of fries in the far booth. James Carter, a lanky 24-year-old with tired brown eyes and a mop of dark hair tucked under a faded Cubs cap, moved methodically from table to table, wiping down sticky surfaces with a damp rag. His sneakers squeaked faintly against the floor, the soles worn thin from months of double shifts. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, unforgiving glow across the diner, highlighting the faint lines of exhaustion etched into James's face. He didn't mind the work, not really. It was honest, and it kept the lights on barely for him and his younger brother Ben, who was waiting back at their cramped apartment, probably curled up with a comic book to distract himself from the dialysis appointments that punctuated their lives like unwelcome punctuation marks. James paused to stretch his back, wincing as a dull ache spread through his shoulders. The tips tonight had been meager, a few crumpled singles, and a handful of quarters, not nearly enough to cover the latest hospital bill, sitting unopened on the kitchen counter. Ben's kidney condition had worsened over the past year, and the medical debt was a shadow that followed James everywhere, heavier than the rain outside. He glanced at the clock above the counter. Another half hour, and he could lock up Trudge the 6 blocks home and check on Ben. The thought of his brother, only 16 and already carrying the weight of a chronic illness, kept James moving. He'd promised their mom before she passed 2 years ago that he'd look after Ben no matter what. That promise was the tether that kept him grounded, even on nights like this, when the world felt like it was closing in. As he cleared a table near the window, James's eyes drifted to booth number 7, tucked in the corner, where the draft always crept in during storms. The vinyl seat was cracked, the table slightly wobbly, but it was the booth's view of the street blurred by rain, but alive with the city's pulse, that made it a favorite for the loners who wandered in late. An hour ago, woman had sat there out of place in her tailored coat and polished heels. She'd ordered a black coffee and a grilled cheese, barely touching either. James had noticed her because she didn't fit the usual crowd too refined for the Rusty Spoon, where the clientele was mostly truckers, night shift workers, and kids looking for a cheap hangout. She'd kept her eyes on her phone, her face unreadable, and when he'd asked, "Everything okay, ma'am?" she'd given a curt nod without looking up. He hadn't pushed. People came to the Rusty Spoon to be left alone, and James knew better than to pry. Now, as he approached the booth to clean it, something caught his eye, a glint of black leather wedged between the cushion and the table's edge. His heart skipped. He reached down and pulled out a sleek, expensive-looking wallet, heavier than it should be. His fingers hesitated, the weight of it foreign in his calloused hands. He glanced around the diner. The trucker was still at the counter, lost in his coffee. The teenagers were gone. The security camera in the corner didn't cover this booth. James knew because he'd helped the manager, Tony, fix it last month, and they'd never gotten around to adjusting the angle. No one would know if he slipped the wallet into his apron. His pulse quickened, a mix of guilt and temptation swirling in his chest. He opened the wallet, careful not to disturb the contents. Inside were crisp $100 bills, at least a dozen stacked neatly, like they'd never been touched. A platinum credit card gleamed under the fluorescent light, the name Abigail Harper embossed in sharp letters. There was a driver's license, too, with an address in a part of Chicago. James had only seen from the L train, Lincoln Park, where the houses had lawns and the streets didn't smell like asphalt and despair. No photo on the license, just a name and a date of birth that put her in her mid-40s. Everything about the wallet screamed wealth, the kind James had only glimpsed in movies or the occasional customer who wandered in by mistake. He stared at the bills, his mind racing. One of those hundreds could buy Ben's meds for a month. 2 could cover the overdue electric bill. All of them, that was a pipe dream. A new start. Maybe even enough to get Ben on a transplant list. His hands trembled, the leather cool against his skin. For a moment, the diner faded away. The rain, the buzz of the lights, the ache in his legs, all of it dissolved, leaving just James and the wallet. He thought of Ben, pale and tired after dialysis, trying to smile through the pain. He thought of the landlord's latest threat to evict them if the rent wasn't paid by next week. He thought of his own dreams, buried somewhere under the weight of survival dreams of studying engineering, of building something that mattered, of being more than a guy scraping by in a greasy diner. The money was right there, unclaimed, unguarded. No one would know. But then he heard his mother's voice, soft but firm, from a memory he clung to like a lifeline. You don't lose yourself, James, no matter what the world throws at you. Honesty isn't just about other people. It's about who you see in the mirror. He closed his eyes, the words anchoring him. He couldn't do it. Not because he was afraid of getting caught, but because he couldn't face Ben or himself if he crossed that line. He snapped the wallet shut, his decision made. James walked to the back where Tony was counting the register. The manager, a gruff man in his 50s with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, looked up as James approached. Found this in booth 7, James said, holding out the wallet. Tony's eyebrows shot up. You open it, he asked, taking it. James nodded. Yeah, it's loaded. Belongs to someone named Abigail Harper. Tony flipped through the bills, whistling low. Jesus, kid. This is more than we make in a week. You sure you want to turn this in? Could solve a lot of problems. James forced a smile, his stomach twisting. I'm sure. Just send it back to her. Tony studied him for a moment, then shrugged. All right. I'll mail it to the address on the license tomorrow. You're a better man than me, Carter. James didn't respond. He didn't feel like a better man, just a tired one, trying to hold on to something the world couldn't take. Back at the booth, he finished cleaning the rag, moving in slow, deliberate circles. The rain hadn't let up, and the streets outside were a blur of wet asphalt and flickering streetlights. He thought about the woman Abigail Harper, wondering what kind of life she led. Probably someone who'd never notice a missing wallet, who'd replace it without a second thought. But that wasn't the point. The point was that James had made a choice, and for tonight, at least, that choice felt like enough. He locked up the diner at 11, flipping the open sign to closed and stepping into the storm. The wind bit at his face, and his old jacket did little to keep out the cold. Puddles soaked his sneakers within seconds, but he didn't care. The walk home was long. The south side streets dark and quiet, except for the occasional car splashing through the rain. Power outages were common here, and the streetlights flickered like they were on their last legs. James kept his head down, careful not to slip on the slick sidewalk. His apartment was a single room in a crumbling building, the kind of place where the heat only worked half the time, and the walls were stained with years of neglect. Ben would be asleep by now, hopefully tucked under a thin blanket on the couch that doubled as his bed. When James reached the apartment, he eased the door open, the hinges creaking softly. The room was dim-lit only by a small lamp in the corner. Ben was there, curled up with a dog-eared copy of Spider-Man resting on his chest. James's heart softened at the sight. He tiptoed to the tiny kitchenette, filled a kettle with water and set it to boil. The medicine drawer was nearly empty, just one dose left for Ben, a reminder of the bills piling up. He sighed, sitting at the wobbly table with a cup of instant coffee, the warmth of the mug, a small comfort against the chill seeping through the walls. His thoughts drifted back to the wallet, to Abigail Harper. He didn't know if she'd even care that her wallet was coming back to her. But he hoped she'd get it, hoped she'd know someone out there still did the right thing even when it hurt. He sipped his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. The rain kept falling outside, a steady rhythm that matched the quiet beat of his heart. Tomorrow would be another long day, another shift, another hospital visit, another step in the endless grind. But tonight, James felt a small spark of peace, a flicker of pride in the choice he'd made. He didn't know it yet, but that choice was the first thread in a tapestry that would weave its way through his life, connecting him to a future he couldn't yet imagine. For now, though, he was just James Carter, a diner worker in a rainy city, holding on to the belief that doing the right thing still mattered. The Rusty Spoon Diner was quieter than usual the following Tuesday, the late October drizzle keeping all but the most determined customers away. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a reddish glow across the wet pavement, and the smell of burnt coffee clung to the air inside, mingling with the faint sweetness of day-old pie. James Carter moved through his shift with practiced ease, refilling ketchup bottles and wiping down the counter, his Cubs cap tilted slightly to one side. His mind was elsewhere on Ben, who'd had a rough night after dialysis, and on the hospital bill that had arrived that morning, another reminder of how close they were to drowning in debt. The memory of the wallet he'd found last week lingered too, though he tried not to dwell on it. He'd done the right thing, and that was that. No point wondering if Abigail Harper had gotten it back or if she'd even noticed it was gone. Around 8 p.m., the bell above the door jingled and James looked up to see a woman step inside, shaking rain from her coat. It was her Abigail Harper, the woman from booth 7. She looked less polished tonight, her tailored coat replaced by a simple navy jacket and jeans, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. But there was no mistaking the quiet confidence in her posture, the kind that came from years of navigating boardrooms and high-stakes deals. She scanned the diner, her eyes landing on James, and for a moment he felt a jolt of recognition, like she knew him, though he couldn't imagine why. She slid into booth 7, the same spot as before, and James grabbed a pot of coffee, his heart beating a little faster than it should. "Evening," he said, approaching with a cautious smile. "Coffee, black." She nodded, her lips curving slightly. "You remember." Her voice was warm with a hint of curiosity that caught him off guard. He poured the coffee, steadying his hand. Hard to forget the only person who orders black coffee without wincing at the taste. She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. "Fair point. This place doesn't exactly scream gourmet." James shrugged, wiping his hands on his apron. "It's honest coffee for honest people. You eating tonight?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Grilled cheese again. Keep it simple." He jotted it down, feeling her eyes on him as he turned back to the counter. Abigail Harper, 45, CEO of Harper Innovations, wasn't sure why she'd come back to the Rusty Spoon. She'd received her wallet in the mail 2 days ago, the cash and cards untouched, along with a sticky note in neat handwriting. "Found this at table 7. Hope you get it back safe. James Waiter." The note had stayed with her, tucked into her desk drawer at her Lincoln Park penthouse, a small reminder of something she couldn't quite name. She'd built her tech company from the ground up, turning a startup into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. But the past few years had hollowed her out. Her divorce had been messy, Her son Liam had drifted away, and the endless board meetings felt like chasing a shadow of the passion she'd once had. The Rusty Spoon, with its chipped mugs and faded charm, was a place she hadn't visited since her college days, when she'd come with friends to laugh over cheap fries and dream of changing the world. That night last week, she'd ended up here by chance, seeking a quiet corner to escape her thoughts. She hadn't expected to lose her wallet, or to have it returned by someone who didn't ask for a reward. As James set the grilled cheese in front of her, Abigail studied him. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a lean build and a face that carried too much weight for his age. His smile was polite, but guarded, and his eyes held a quiet resilience that reminded her of herself years ago, before the world had polished her edges. "You're James, right?" she asked, glancing at his name tag. He nodded a little, surprised. "Yeah. You're Abigail." Her eyebrows lifted and he flushed. "Sorry, I saw your name on the license when I found your wallet." "Hope that's not weird." She shook her head. "Not weird. I appreciated you sending it back. Most people wouldn't." James shrugged, wiping the table next to hers to keep his hands busy. "Didn't seem right to keep it. Besides, you looked like you might need it more than I do." It was a joke, but her smile faded slightly, and he cursed himself for saying it. "I mean, you know, fancy coat and all," he added quickly. Abigail laughed again, and this time it reached her eyes. "Fancy coat's just for show. You'd be surprised how much trouble it hides." James tilted his head, curious but not wanting to push. "Yeah, well, trouble's got a way of finding everybody, fancy coat or not." She nodded, sipping her coffee. "So, James, what's your story? You don't strike me as someone who dreams of slinging coffee for a living." He hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Most customers didn't care enough to ask. "Just paying the bills," he said finally. "Got a brother who needs me, so I do what I gotta do." She leaned forward slightly. "That's a lot for someone your age." "What's he like?" Your brother James's face softened. "Ben's 16, smart as hell, loves comics. He's sick, though. Kidneys, makes things tough." His voice was steady, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Abigail felt a pang in her chest, thinking of Liam, her own son, who was 19 and barely spoke to her anymore. She'd been so focused on her company after the divorce that she'd let the distance grow, and now it felt like a chasm. "Sounds like you're a good brother," she said softly. James shrugged again, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing what I can." He moved to check on the trucker at the counter, leaving Abigail to her thoughts. She watched him work, noting the way he moved with quiet efficiency, the way he smiled at the other customers despite the fatigue in his eyes. There was something about him ordinary, yet rare. She couldn't shake the feeling that returning her wallet wasn't just a one-off act, but a window into who he was. Over the next week, Abigail became a regular at the Rusty Spoon, always choosing booth 7, always ordering black coffee and something small. James got used to her presence, the way she'd ask about his day or make a dry comment about the diner's questionable jukebox. Their conversations were light at first, about the rain that never seemed to stop the Cubs' latest loss, or the way Chicago smelled like wet concrete, and possibility after a storm. But there was an ease to it, a rhythm that felt natural, like two people who'd known each other longer than they had. One night, as James refilled her coffee, she asked, "What would you be doing if you weren't here?" He paused the question, hitting deeper than he expected. "I was in college for a bit," he admitted. "Engineering. Wanted to build stuff, bridges maybe, or software, something that lasts. But life got in the way." He didn't mention Ben's illness or the bills that had forced him to drop out after a year, but Abigail could fill in the blanks. "You're young," she said. "Plenty of time to get back to it." James gave a half-smile, skeptical, but not bitter. Yeah, maybe. Dreams are expensive, though. She nodded, understanding more than he knew. She'd had her own dreams once before they turned into stock options and shareholder meetings. They are, she said quietly. But sometimes the right person comes along to remind you they're worth chasing. James didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and moved to clear a table, the moment lingering between them like the steam rising from her coffee. Behind the scenes, Abigail was already moving pieces. She'd asked her assistant to look into the rusty spoon to confirm the wallet had come from James Carter, a waiter with no record of trouble, just a kid trying to keep his head above water. She'd also called Tony, the manager who'd grumbled but confirmed James was his best worker. Reliable, honest, never late. Kid's got a brother in the hospital, Tony had added. Works himself to the bone for that boy. The information settled heavily in Abigail's mind. She wasn't sure why she cared so much, but something about James's quiet integrity had pierced the fog she'd been living in since her divorce. The world she navigated, full of contracts and calculated risks, rarely rewarded kindness without strings. Yet here was this young man who'd given without asking, who'd chosen right when wrong would have been easier. One night, as James locked up the diner, Abigail lingered outside under the awning, the rain tapping steadily above. "You ever think about going back to school?" she asked, pulling her jacket tighter. He glanced at her, surprised she was still there. "Every day," he said honestly. "But it's not that simple. My brother needs me here. Meds, appointments, rent, it all adds up." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "You're doing good by him, James. Not everyone would." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. "He's family. You do what you gotta do." She smiled faintly, then said, "Keep doing that, James. It'll take you further than you think." She turned and disappeared into the rain, leaving him standing there, unsure why her words felt like a promise. The next morning, James got a call from the hospital. A portion of Ben's latest bill, thousands of dollars, had been paid anonymously. The nurse wouldn't say who, only that it was enough to cover the next few dialysis sessions. James sat on the edge of his couch, staring at the phone, his chest tight, with a mix of relief and disbelief. Ben, reading a comic nearby, looked up. "You okay, man?" James nodded, forcing a grin. "Yeah, kid. Better than okay." He didn't know it was Abigail, not yet, but he felt a shift, like the world had tilted slightly in his favor for the first time in years. And somewhere across town, Abigail sat in her office, staring at the sticky note from her wallet, wondering how a single act of honesty could make her feel more alive than she had in a decade. The Rusty Spoon diner hummed with its usual late-night rhythm, the clink of dishes and the low murmur of conversation, blending with the soft patter of rain against the windows. It was early November now, and Chicago's chill had settled in, seeping through the diner's drafty corners. James Carter moved through his shift with a quiet focus, his Cubs cap pulled low as he balanced a tray of coffee mugs and a plate of meatloaf for a regular at the counter. The past few weeks had felt different, lighter, somehow, ever since the hospital called about the anonymous payment for Ben's treatment. It wasn't a cure. Ben's kidney condition still loomed like a storm cloud, but it was a reprieve, a chance to breathe without the constant weight of unpaid bills. James didn't know who'd paid, but he suspected Abigail Harper, the woman who'd become a fixture at Booth 7, her black coffee and sharp eyes now as familiar as the diner's chipped mugs. Abigail had been coming in 3 or 4 times a week, always sitting in the same spot, always ordering the same thing. Their conversations had grown longer, deeper, moving beyond small talk about the weather or the Cubs' losing streak. She'd ask about Ben, about how James was holding up, and he'd find himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He told her about dropping out of college, about the engineering classes he'd loved before life derailed him about the way Ben's laughter could still light up their tiny apartment despite everything. Abigail listened, really listened, her questions sharp but kind, like she was piecing together a puzzle. James didn't know much about her, only that she worked in tech and carried a quiet sadness that mirrored his own. He didn't push for details. Diners were for escaping, not interrogating, but he felt a connection, fragile but real, growing between them. Tonight, as he refilled her coffee, Abigail looked different, more purposeful. Her navy jacket swapped for a tailored blazer that made her seem like she'd just stepped out of a meeting. "James," she said, setting her mug down, "I've been thinking about what you said, about engineering, about wanting to build something that lasts." He paused, wiping his hands on his apron, caught off guard by the shift in her tone. "Yeah," he said, cautious. "What about it?" She leaned forward, her eyes steady. "I run a tech company, Harper Innovations. We build software systems, things that last like you said. I looked into some programs, and there's an online engineering course through a university here in Chicago. Flexible hours, fully accredited. I'd like to sponsor you to take it." James blinked the words, not fully registering. "Sponsor me, like pay for it." Abigail nodded. "Tuition books the works. No strings attached. You keep working here if you want, but this could get you back on track." His stomach twisted, a mix of hope and suspicion. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held more history than he could guess. "Because you gave me back my wallet when you could have kept it. That tells me more about you than you think." James shifted, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. "I don't know, Abigail. That's a lot. I've got Ben, the diner bills. I can't just—" She cut him off gently. "You can. It's online. You set the pace. And Ben needs you to have a future, not just a paycheck." He didn't say yes right away. The idea felt too big, like a door he'd thought was locked forever had suddenly cracked open. He told her he'd think about it, and for the next few days he did, lying awake in the dark, listening to the creak of their apartment's pipes, weighing the risk against the possibility. Ben noticed the change in him, teasing, "You're thinking too hard, man. Your brain's gonna overheat." James laughed, ruffling his brother's hair, but the decision gnawed at him. What if he failed? What if he couldn't keep up? But then he thought of his mom, of her voice telling him to hold on to himself, and he knew he couldn't let fear win. He called Abigail the next evening, his voice steady despite the nerves. "I'm in," he said simply. She didn't gush or make a big deal of it, just sent him the enrollment details and a quiet, "You've got this, James." The next month was a blur of new routines. James kept his shifts at the Rusty Spoon, working nights and squeezing study sessions into the early mornings while Ben slept. The online engineering course was intense coding circuits, math, that made his head spin, but it lit something in him, a spark he hadn't felt since his college days. He'd sit at the kitchen table, laptop, glowing, scribbling notes on a legal pad, losing himself in problems that had solutions, unlike the endless mess of medical bills. Ben, curious as ever, would peek over his shoulder, asking questions about binary code or bridge designs, his eyes bright despite the fatigue from dialysis. "You're gonna build something cool someday," Ben said one night, and James felt a lump in his throat, because for the first time in years, he believed it might be true. Abigail kept coming to the diner, her presence a quiet anchor. She didn't hover or check on his progress like a teacher, but she'd ask questions that showed she understood the work. Technical questions about algorithms or design principles that made James realize she wasn't just some corporate suit. One night, as he cleared her plate, she said, "You're good at this, you know, the course. Tony says you're still his best worker. but I can see your brain's somewhere else now." James grinned a little sheepish. "Yeah, well, it's hard to think about meatloaf when I'm trying to debug code." She laughed, then grew serious. "I've got a small project at my company. Nothing big, a prototype for a data management tool. I'd like you to take a look, maybe help with the specs. Paid, of course." James froze the rag in his hand still. "Me, I'm just starting out. I'm not." She waved him off. "You're smart, James. And you've got instinct. Say yes, and I'll send you the details." He nodded, heart pounding, not trusting himself to say more. The project was a challenge unlike anything he'd done at the diner or in his early college classes. He spent late nights poring over documentation, sketching out code on napkins during breaks, and emailing questions to Abigail's team. The pressure was intense, balancing the diner, Ben's appointments, and now this. But it felt like the good kind of pressure, the kind that pushed him to grow. Ben noticed it too, joking. "You're like a superhero, man, saving the day with code." James laughed, but he felt the weight of it, the fear of letting Abigail down, of proving he wasn't cut out for this after all. Still, he pushed through, and when he submitted the prototype specs, he got an email from Abigail's lead engineer, Solid Work Carter. Clean, efficient, creative. "We're impressed." James read it 3 times, a grin spreading across his face. Abigail, meanwhile, was navigating her own changes. Inspired by James's quiet determination, she'd started texting Liam more often small messages about his college classes or a funny memory from when he was little. To her surprise, he'd started replying not long conversations, but enough to crack the wall between them. One night at the diner, she told James about it, her voice softer than usual. "I haven't been a great mom," she admitted, stirring her coffee. "Got caught up in work. Let him slip away. But seeing you with Ben, it reminds me I can still try." James didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, but her words stayed with him. He saw the parallels in their lives, 2 people carrying different kinds of burdens, finding a way to keep going. As the weeks passed, James's confidence grew. His professors praised his problem-solving, and his classmates started asking him for help with assignments. But the diner remained his anchor, the familiar squeak of the floor and the smell of grease grounding him. He insisted on keeping his job, telling Abigail, "This place keeps me honest. Reminds me where I came from." She respected that, though she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he pushed himself to juggle everything. One evening, as the diner emptied out, she slid an envelope across the table. Inside was an offer, a part-time internship at Harper Innovations starting in the new year. "It's not charity," she said firmly. "You earned it with that prototype. It's a chance to see what you can do in the real world." James stared at the letter, his throat tight. He wanted to say yes, but the thought of leaving the rusty spoon, of stepping into a world he didn't fully understand, scared him. "What if I'm not ready?" he asked quietly. Abigail's eyes softened. "You're ready, James. You just don't know it yet." That night, as he walked home through the cold, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement, James felt the weight of possibility. The internship was a door to a future he'd almost given up on, but it came with risks, less time with Ben, the chance of failing in a world where he didn't belong. He thought of Abigail, of the way she believed in him, and of Ben, who deserved a brother who didn't just survive, but thrived. By the time he reached his apartment, his mind was made up. He'd take the internship, not just for himself, but for the kid asleep on the couch, dreaming of superheroes and a better tomorrow. The Chicago skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harper Innovations' downtown headquarters, a constellation of lights against the November night. Inside the grand ballroom, the company's annual gala was in full swing, chandeliers casting a warm glow over executives in tuxedos and gowns, their laughter mingling with the clink of champagne glasses. James Carter, now 25, stood near the back, tugging at the sleeves of his rented Navy suit, feeling like an imposter among the polished crowd. A year ago, he'd been wiping down tables at the Rusty Spoon Diner, his world confined to greasy counters and hospital bills. Now he was a junior software engineer at Harper Innovations, his name badge clipped proudly to his lapel. The journey from diner to corporate office hadn't been easy. Late nights, studying, early mornings, coding, and endless hours balancing his job with Ben's care, but every step had been worth it. Tonight, though, he felt the weight of how far he'd come, and it made his palms sweat. James glanced across the room where Abigail Harper stood near the stage, her silver dress catching the light, as she spoke with a group of board members. She was retiring as CEO, passing the reins to a younger executive, and the gala was as much a celebration of her legacy as it was a showcase of the company's future. James hadn't seen her much since starting his internship 9 months ago, but their friendship remained a quiet constant, like a lighthouse guiding him through uncharted waters. She'd never treated him like a project, never flaunted her role in his rise, but he knew none of this. The job, the degree he was close to finishing, the hope in Ben's eyes would have happened without her belief in him. It all traced back to that rainy night at the Rusty Spoon, when he'd chosen to return her wallet instead of keeping the cash that could have eased his burdens. As the evening progressed, the host tapped the microphone calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our retiring CEO Abigail Harper for her final remarks." The room erupted in applause, and James clapped too, his chest tight with gratitude. Abigail stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding, yet warm, the same way she'd looked in Booth 7 all those months ago. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "Tonight isn't about farewells. It's about beginnings, about the people who remind us that character still matters, that kindness isn't weakness, and that the smallest actions can change everything." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd, until it found James, lingering just long enough to make his heart race. "A little over a year ago, I lost something. Not just a wallet, but a piece of my self-trust in a world that often feels cold and transactional. And then someone I didn't know, a waiter in a small diner, returned that wallet to me, untouched, without asking for a reward." The room was silent, every eye on Abigail. James felt his face heat, wishing he could shrink into the shadows, but her words held him in place. That act, she continued, wasn't just about a wallet. It was about integrity, about choosing what's right when no one's watching. That waiter is here tonight no longer pouring coffee, but building the future of this company. His name is James Carter. The spotlight swung toward him, and the crowd turned, applause rising like a wave. James stood, his legs unsteady, managing a small nod as his colleagues smiled and clapped. He didn't cry, he'd promised himself he wouldn't, but his throat burned with emotion. Abigail's voice softened. "James reminded me, and I hope he reminds all of you, that the most brilliant minds can be found in the humblest places, and that one honest choice can spark a chain of change." The applause faded, and the gala continued, but James felt the weight of her words settle over him. He'd never seen himself as special, just a guy trying to do right by his brother, to keep his head above water. But Abigail's speech made him realize his choice that night hadn't just changed his life. It had touched hers too, and maybe others he'd never know. Later, as the crowd mingled, Abigail found him near the dessert table, her smile lighter than he'd ever seen it. "I hope I didn't embarrass you," she said, holding a glass of sparkling water. James laughed, shaking his head. You made me sound like some kind of hero. I just gave back a wallet. She looked at him, her eyes warm. You did more than that, James. You gave me back a piece of hope I didn't know I'd lost. He shifted, uncomfortable with the praise, but grateful. What about you? Retiring sounds big. What's next? Abigail shrugged, a rare vulnerability in her expression. Travel, maybe. Volunteer. Spend time with someone important. James raised an eyebrow. Your son? She nodded, her smile softening. Liam, we've been having lunch every Sunday. It's not perfect, but it's a start. He asked about you, wants to meet the guy who got his mom to stop hiding behind her work. James grinned, a warmth spreading through him. That's good, Abigail. Really good. As the night wound down, James stepped outside the cool Chicago air, a relief after the stuffy ballroom. He walked past a corner cafe, the kind of place he might have worked at in another life, and noticed a young woman at an outdoor table frantically checking her pockets. His eyes caught a worn leather wallet on the chair behind her. Without hesitating, he picked it up and tapped her shoulder. Looking for something, he asked, holding it out. The woman's face lit up with relief. Oh my God, thank you. I thought I'd lost everything. James smiled, the moment echoing that night at the Rusty Spoon. Sometimes losing something brings you to exactly where you're meant to be. He said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. She laughed, puzzled but grateful, and James walked on the city lights, reflecting off the wet pavement. Back at his apartment, Ben was awake, sprawled on the couch with a comic book. How was the fancy party? He asked, grinning. James sat beside him, loosening his tie. Fancy. Loud. But good. He paused, then looked at his brother. You know, Ben, I used to think doing the right thing was just about getting by, about not screwing up. But it's more than that. It's like planting a seed. You don't always see what grows, but it spreads. Ben raised an eyebrow, teasing. You sound like a fortune cookie. James laughed, shoving his shoulder. Yeah, well, maybe I'm on to something. Lesson and takeaway. The story of James and Abigail teaches us that integrity and kindness, even in the smallest moments, can create ripples that transform lives. James's decision to return a wallet wasn't just about honesty. It was a spark that ignited hope, rebuilt trust, and opened doors to a future he never imagined. For young Americans, this is a reminder that character matters, that doing what's right when no one's watching builds not just your own path, but lifts others along the way. Kindness isn't a transaction. It's a legacy. Whether you're in a diner or a boardroom, one honest act can echo far beyond the moment, inspiring others to do the same, and proving that the world still runs on trust and connection. That night, as James lay in bed, the city's hum filtering through the window, he thought about the wallet, the diner, and the gala. He thought about Abigail, who'd seen something in him he hadn't seen in himself, and about Ben, who was getting stronger every day. He thought about the young woman at the cafe, whose night was a little better because of him, and he realized that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about building something that lasts one choice at a time. Across town, Abigail sat in her penthouse, drafting an email to Liam, inviting him to meet James. She smiled, knowing that a single act of honesty had not only rebuilt a young man's future, but had also helped her find her way back to her son. The ripples of that rainy night at the Rusty Spoon were still spreading, touching lives in ways neither of them could have predicted, proving that sometimes the smallest kindness echoes the loudest.